Joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, and member of the Armed Services Committee, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. They recently returned from a trip to Poland, where they met with border officials and Ukrainian refugees.
You also met with an ambassador. His last name was Brzezinski. And he told us that he was really impressed with the bipartisan nature of Republicans, Democrats. You all talked about you all and several others that really you all are standing shoulder to shoulder trying to figure out the best way forward, not only for Ukraine, but for the Western Alliance.
America's standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. And across the spectrum, when I'm home, I'm talking to people about this, they get it. They're seeing it on their TV screens and online every night, barbaric. And, you know, these are cowardly attacks. I mean, at the same time that the troops are making progress on the ground, pushing Russians back, every night Russia is shelling these civilian targets, homes, hospitals, churches, schools. I mean, it's horrible. We met with the refugees coming across the border, and, you know, it was heartbreaking. They're crying and asking us to do more.
Yeah, talk about that. I mean, the greatest crisis, a refugee crisis since World War II.
You know, you think of the magnitude of it in the numbers, the statistics are just daunting. 3 million children and women, because the men have stayed behind to fight. But in individual terms, I am still haunted by those faces and voices, particularly the children carrying their pets or their stuffed animals, and the moms, all of them just wanting to go home. They just want to go home. And one woman saying to me through her tears, nothing is safe. And remember, they had just been through a bombing 12 miles away from the Ukrainian border, where the Russians threw missiles at their town training center, and they were fleeing from that bombing just 12 miles away, coming across the border. So it is really a haunting catastrophe.
Senator Portman, good morning. You talked about the horrors that you're hearing about from these refugees. We're hearing them as well as they cross into Poland, more than 2 million of them. You talked about President Zelensky's request to do more. His big request that the West has not complied with is a no-fly zone. I gather that you're in favor of that. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what are your concerns if there is a no-fly zone in place? Do you share some of the concerns about the escalation that may come with, say, a NATO jet shooting down a Russian plane?
Yeah, well, I don't think the no-fly zone is what we're talking about now. I think we're talking about an effective no-fly zone, which is to have enough anti-aircraft weapons and enough planes to be able to enforce a no-fly zone over some of these cities that are just getting mercilessly shelled. So
you're saying the Ukrainians doing that and not NATO troops, right?
Yeah.
When you say an effective no-fly zone.
Right. I mean, what happened last night is, I think, very positive, which is that Slovakia gave Ukraine S-300s, which is the best anti-aircraft system that we have among our allies in that region. And it was backfilled by Germany and Netherlands. So that's where the Europeans can step up. And when the president goes to NATO today, he has to ask them to do more of that. They need to step up and help in terms of allowing these former Warsaw Pact countries that have the kind of weapons that are interoperable with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians know how to use them, including the MiGs, by the way, these MiG-29s, and then backfill and help them. And we should do the same thing. But that, to me, was the most positive thing I've heard in a couple of days, was that Germany and the Netherlands are actually stepping up. Slovakia is stepping up. And if you have that kind of a weapon there, you can stop these missiles. Richard just talked about the bombing that occurred outside of Lviv when we were there 5 hours before we got there. Most of those missiles were shot out of the air by anti-aircraft weapons, thank God. Some got through and killed 35 people, wounded 134. But we need more of that. And there's no reason, Joe, we shouldn't be providing more. Right now, in our stocks here in America, we are told through public reporting that we have these S-300s that we got years ago to try to, see what the Russians were.
Aren't we sending some of them?
We're sending some of them. The kind that we're sending are not as powerful or as effective as the S-300s. So let's go ahead and send we're sending what's called SA-8s, which are lower altitude.
Right.
We need the high altitude stuff because these missiles are coming in from Russia, from Belarus.
Do you agree, Senator?
We can do more.
I agree totally. Wow. Remember that a lot of these missiles, a lot of the ordnance is coming from outside of Ukraine's borders, so that a no-fly zone really won't prevent a lot of the bombing, shelling, missiles. But I agree totally with Rob that We can send more of the aerial defense, but also more drones. Call on our Israeli friends perhaps to contribute more drones. We can provide more of the Turkish drones, which have proved very effective. But essentially,
let me just stop and ask. Why haven't we done this already? I do wonder.
No, it's easy for us to say.
I just wonder what are our NATO allies waiting for in terms of drones? What are we waiting for in terms of anti-aircraft? I mean, I know Turkey's talking about
that. Is the question.
What are we waiting for? Because we have war crimes, Senator.
Yeah, here we are, day 27, Joe.
Every night.
27 days.
Day 27. So, what, do we wait till the 50th day? How many more Ukrainians die before we give them what they need in terms of anti-aircraft weaponry?
And Rob Portman and I have been pressing and talk about the bipartisan nature of this trip. We came back pressing even more for the urgency of action, and not only on the military front, but also the economic front, where stronger sanctions, and Senator Portman is really the expert on this, as a former trade representative, but imposing these sanctions on all the Russian banks, strangle Putin's war machine by denying him revenue from oil and gas sales.
Again, what's this a debate?
That's a big topic at the NATO summit.
Well, okay, so that's my question, because when you say we should be doing drones or more economic support, are we talking we, the United States, or NATO as a whole? Because NATO as a whole, what has NATO done?
Well,
actually,
again, NATO's starting to step up more, should have stepped up earlier, in my view, to do more, like helping with regard to backfilling the Slovakian anti-aircraft weapons. But at this summit, I think perhaps the most important thing to happen is for President Biden to move from organizing this coalition, which he's done well, to leading. And leading means an embargo on Russian oil and gas, because the number one source of revenue for Russia, of course, is its energy. It's what's fueling this war machine. And all these sanctions combined are not as effective as saying, you know what, not only is the United States not going to buy any more oil, and for us that's a relatively small part of our total consumption, but in Europe, these NATO countries, they need to also stop this sale of this purchase of this Russian energy, because that's what's fueling the war machine. And then we need to help backfill them, including with LNG. You can produce these, LNG ports, the export ports and the import ports in Europe relatively quickly. So let's get moving on it. Let's get the contracts in place. Let's provide them the energy that they need. We've got it. Other countries do. Qatar and others are willing to step forward and help. That probably, Mika, is the most important thing to come out of this summit, if it does, which is to say, let's cut off the revenue to Vladimir Putin.
And one more point here, because we began on the humanitarian crisis. Hopefully this war will end soon, and that President Biden, who has demonstrated extraordinary leadership in unifying NATO, will continue to lead from the front. And we have been pushing on a bipartisan basis since our visit to Ukraine, and have urged this kind of action continuously and constantly, but also in Poland, when he visits there, he will see this humanitarian crisis. And I hope he'll lead as well on mobilizing the world to do more to help the Poles, who have opened their hearts and arms in a way that is so inspiring, as harrowing and haunting as the refugee situations are. Very uplifting is the reaction of the Polish people. The population of Warsaw, according to Mark Brzezinski, has grown by about 10%. Think of it for a moment, 10% increase. And so this is a humanitarian effort that really should unite the world.
So let's talk about Joe Biden's leadership. Both of you were saying he needs to lead. He's organized, and both of you say he's done a good job organizing it. You say he needs to lead it. Obviously, though, I know you understand better than most, there is a balancing act. You can't get too far ahead of the Germans. You can't get too far ahead of the French. It is a constant balancing act, is it not? Because, we've gotten ahead of our allies before over the past 20 years, and it hasn't always worked out very well for them.
Yeah, Joe, it's a balance, but they're ahead of us on some things, as you know. They've already begun to seize, not just freeze assets of oligarchs, as an example. And providing that funding for the refugee crisis is absolutely essential. They've gone ahead of us in terms of trade. They've said that no longer will you get most favored nation status in trading with Europe. And yet, we've got legislation here in the Congress is still kicking around, in part because initially President Biden opposed that. There are about 5 things he opposed that we later did, like the oil embargo.
Didn't that pass the House overwhelmingly?
Passed the House. Now I got to pass the Senate.
Why hasn't it passed the Senate yet?
Well, because the House added some things on it that some senators are not happy about. I'd like to just get it done.
Isn't that the Senate's fault? Not Joe. I mean, you got to give Joe Biden a bill before he can sign the bill.
But again, initially he opposed doing it. And my only point is there's some things that the Europeans have actually done ahead of us. So it's not entirely about us telling them to catch up. But on issues, the big issues, which is the military assistance to Ukraine so they can defend themselves, particularly anything that has to do with stopping these as I said earlier, cowardly and barbaric bombings. They need to help us more on. Drones is an example. They can help us more there. Turkey can help more there. Secondly, we've got to be sure that this oil and gas embargo happens, because otherwise the revenue will keep flowing. And I think the sanctions will not be nearly as effective. So these are areas where he has to kind of get our NATO friends out of their comfort zone and lead by example.
Let me ask this question to both of you. Let's say there's a chemical weapons attack in Mariupol, or a tactical nuclear weapon used somewhere near Kyiv. Does NATO need to go in at that point? Senator, I'll start with you, Blumenthal.
I think, depending on its location, the use of either chemical or biological weapons or a tactical nuclear weapon potentially endangers all of the countries, the NATO countries bordering Ukraine, simply by virtue of the potential for contagion or radioactivity. There is a very strong case to be made that it is potentially an attack on NATO, and NATO does need to be involved. We ought to be very, very careful and cautious, and I give the president great credit on this score as well. He has been deliberate and purposeful and has taken account of the risks in a very responsible way. But I do think that the use of that kind of non-conventional weapons, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I will say, also a cyber attack, potentially crippling our utilities, our financial system, our healthcare system. And we need to be cautious, but we also need to draw some lines here so that Vladimir Putin, as delusional as he may be, understands where we are.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.